Welcome everybody to the newest installment in the Orange Wheel podcast, where we aim to support leaders in understanding the monetary transition. I'm joined today by Wyatt O'Rourke. Wyatt is one of the most eclectic minds, I think, in the Bitcoin space today. He has really at that intersection of finance, libertarianism, and Bitcoin. So I think it's a pretty interesting profile. And Wyatt and I have met in person in New York briefly at the Unconference and have kind of met virtually through a couple different channels. So really excited that we can make the time to have him join us on the podcast. We've had to reschedule a few times, but I think there's even more to discuss now that we've been able to land on today. So Wyatt, thanks for joining today. How are things going?
Dude, Ted, thanks for having me. I'm stoked to be on.
Fantastic. Maybe to kick off, be great to hear a little bit about your background, how you came into Bitcoin, and certainly hear about Basilic and what your focus is today in the Bitcoin space.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I would say, probably a fairly standard Bitcoin story. I went to, university, got a finance degree. We got taught a bunch of, Keynesian BS. I was fully indoctrinated, really looked up to Warren Buffett, had heard of Bitcoin, instantly debugged it with all the FUD I knew. And so that was unfortunate, really dismissing, 2017 when I first heard of it. But then during the pandemic in 2020, was locked in my apartment with my roommate, who happened to be a pretty big Bitcoiner, and he was just peppering me, trying to get me to listen to his podcast, and I did, just to get him to shut up. And I'm very happy he was persistent. I think I first listened to Press and Pish, and we kind of come from similar backgrounds, value investing, TradFi guys, and so it really clicked with me. And then Bitcoin's one of those things, once you see it, you can't unsee it, and I was instantly down the rabbit hole, and was just devouring Bitcoin content. I was working in traditional finance at the time. I've done some real estate, some asset management, some IB, some PE, but really just felt more called to be an entrepreneur. So I had a startup previously in the employer of record space. We were doing payroll processing, workers' comp, that sort of thing, and that went under. And having gotten a taste of being an entrepreneur, I didn't want to go back and work for somebody else. And at this point, I was a Bitcoin maximalist. And so I really wanted to start a Bitcoin company. And I'm very involved with the Denver Bitcoin community. I owe a ton to them. Helped found the space. I serve on our leadership team there. And I really want to start a Bitcoin business, but I can't code, and all my skills and experience are in finance. I was like, shoot, how do I do this? And so was just talking to friends and mentors, and decided to adopt the RIA business model. So I went fully independent to start, and with the intention of servicing Bitcoiners. I can brand myself as a Bitcoin financial advisor. We help people with sound money strategies, and our ultimate goal is prosperities with purpose. And I would say a majority of my clients are Bitcoiners. We still do some TradFi stuff, but I think it's my fiduciary obligation to talk to my clients about Bitcoin and help them with their Bitcoin holdings. And I would say a majority of my clients are kind of in a similar position where they've stacked sats, and now they're asking, now what? It's a little bit unfortunate. Do you think the tides are changing on this a little bit? But there's quite a bit of disdain for professional services within Bitcoin. I'm not quite sure why that is. I have a couple guesses, but a lot of folks are just like, well, I have Bitcoin, I don't need you. And it's like, well, that's great, you have Bitcoin, but that doesn't mean, you can't benefit from professional services. And I love my job. I love getting to talk about, Bitcoin and helping people with Bitcoin. And it's been really rewarding.
Amazing. And so maybe for the audience that aren't familiar with how some of these US-based acronyms, RAI, can you just elaborate a bit more on what that entails?
Yeah, so I'm a registered investment advisor, wealth manager, financial advisor. That is the formal acronym. And I would say kind of, our shtick is, we really want to get people exposure to spot bear asset Bitcoin. That's crucially important to us. And we partnered with, Unchained, which I think is probably the leading, Bitcoin financial services company. I'm stoked to work with those guys. And what we're able to do is offer, people a tiers of custody solutions. And, we work and spend a lot of time on cold storage, custody management, understanding with self-custody, there is no silver bullet. It's a series of trade-offs. And so, we're actually able to kind of find a solution that works best with what those trade-offs, our clients are willing to take. So sometimes, a client will hold 2 keys and chain has 1. We have the ability to hold a key in the quorum. And then we can also get them, enrolled in multi-institutional, multi-sig. And so we can kind of really meet them where they're at and what they're most comfortable with, depending on their familiarity with the asset and the technology. Now, on the financial planning side, where we do a lot of our work with Bitcoiners, it's really helping them identify and understand what it's like holding, a finitely scarce asset and the responsibilities and stewardship that comes with that. And then we try to be, on the cutting edge of understanding the Bitcoin financial services ecosystem as a whole. And my role as a advisor, I think this is, obviously I'm biased, but I think this is the most exciting industry to be in right now, because we have this very deep TradFi playbook that's being applied to Bitcoin. So we don't really need to recreate the wheel here. We just need to adopt these strategies for Bitcoin. And so I'm very excited helping my clients take advantage of things. There's some Bitcoin centric like HELOC products. So there's Bitcoin denominated, life insurance, or the Bitcoin collateralized lending products. And so it's making my job a lot easier with these other entrepreneurs in the space are building these products that we can help better serve our clients with.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah. And I feel the same way in many regards. I think as Bitcoin matures, there's certainly going to still be room for like the those who are really, I don't know, I want to use a pleasant word for this, but maximizing on the libertarian side and really self-custodying, and certainly if certain individuals want to be almost 100% allocated only to Bitcoin, that's fair. That's their own prerogative. But I do believe as it becomes more mainstream, there's going to be need for, as you've kind of said, professional services and different financial products around Bitcoin, but also diversification into potentially where Bitcoin fits within a broader portfolio. So I certainly see the value in bringing that traditional portfolio management investment advisor lens to the world of Bitcoin. And then also, as you brought up, like there's certain complexities of having a bearer asset that's digital that is new for many investors, right? So the custody solutions and so forth, and helping to guide clients to the right solution for where they're at. Yeah, and I think the trade-offs, I think that's important to come with that independent perspective of what's the right solution, because it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all answer. So be great to hear a little bit more about like kind of your client base. So I think, is it individuals and small businesses? Is that kind of the focus today? How do you see your client base characterized today? And is there any trends in terms of how it's evolving going forward?
Yeah, that is predominantly it. Predominantly serving, higher net worth individuals, on the Bitcoin, side of things. I would say average age is probably, 35 to 45. So probably skews like a bit younger compared to, I would say, classic wealth management firms. I imagine most of that is because of Bitcoin. But it's exciting. My client base, I love chatting with my clients because oftentimes they're very well astute when it comes to Bitcoin, and whether it's just actual cold storage and being able to sign transactions, or they've started buying some on an exchange, and so that's very exciting. It's a fun experience to be able to learn from your clients as well, and we really view ourselves along the journey with them. Still do service some small businesses as well. I have a few CPA connections in town that we pick up, solo K or small company 401k, and it's a little bit more challenging given the current U.S. regulatory environment to integrate Bitcoin into those offerings. Still a lot of red tape. What we're able to offer in terms of investment options with the plan administration. Fortunately, I give Unchained a ton of credit. There are, depending on the business, how many employees they have, and all that sort of stuff. Like we can do certain retirement accounts, like SEP IRA, Unchained, where you can actually hold the bearer asset spot Bitcoin, hold your keys, and be in full control of your wealth. Sometimes we are kind of pigeonholed into ETF exposure, just because that's what the account structure will allow. But it's really up to us to identify how we're able to best serve our clients in terms of Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, I think the US is certainly, I think, ahead of most countries in the sense, even allowing things like Bitcoin ETFs into retirement plans and accounts is already ahead of most countries. So, but I certainly see it heading more and more optionality in the Bitcoin space for different registered accounts. So it's great to see that.
Well, and it's very exciting. I talk about this in my book, the Bitcoinization of Finance. I kind of call this like diversifying within Bitcoin. And so us as financiers, and we have a responsibility of working in the finance industry to push the finance industry forward within the principles, ethos, and values of Bitcoin. That's not a responsibility I take lightly, but it's very exciting to me seeing the development of these new financial products. And personally, collaborative multi-sig advocate, and we try to enforce that with our clients as much as we can. But understanding too, at the stage of the game where we're at in Bitcoin, I think it's really about getting dollars into Bitcoin and understanding we need different financial products to do so, and working within the constraints of various investment mandates, and even having synthetic exposure to Bitcoin, I think is overall a healthy development for the industry as we stand today.
Certainly. So maybe that's a good segue. I mean, last we met, you were about to go on a hunting trip, and then after that, it was the we'll have to hear that at the end. But then in Denver, you co-hosted an event on a summit on finance of Bitcoin, right? Maybe just great to hear how that event went, and any expectations of doing something similar in the future.
Yeah, I think we're definitely going to run it back. It went extremely well. Very good feedback, which my colleague Jordan Guess and I are very appreciative. We planned it together. He's a Bitcoin CPA, so we hit it off instantly, being very synergistically in the industry at large together. And it was awesome, man. And we're very proud of the speaker lineup and the content we were able to use. And then we try to be very intentional about how we structure the event. So gave people a lot of time to network and organically meet and learn from each other. The case study I've been kind of using, just because I think it's awesome, is one of our sponsors, Revolution Mortgage. They're Bitcoiners, but they're trying to learn how they can apply Bitcoin to the mortgage industry and better serve growing base of Bitcoin clients. And so they set up a working group upstairs, and we had people constantly funneling up to them, and they were just there to learn and share their experience. And so it was just really cool. That was ultimately our goal for the summit. Selfishly, Jordan and I kept joking where it's pretty niche. I'm part of the Bitcoin Financial Advisors Network, and there's 11 of us, and there's 300,000 financial advisors in the United States.
11 across the entire United States.
That's correct. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Right. And, I'm sure there's a handful more that, aren't a part of the group, but it's the best benchmark I got. And it's kind of a shame because, I'm a financial professional. I'm not a tax or legal professional. And, when I want to make a referral for, one of my clients, whether it's regarding, tax or legal advice, I have a very small network right now in terms of professionals that I trust, deeply understand Bitcoin and have, applied it to their respective practices and fields. So we really wanted to bring, RIAs, CPAs, estate planning attorneys, managers together, just so that, nothing like, I guess I'm a little old school this way, but I don't think there's anything better than, shaking a colleague's hand and getting to know them, face to face. So giving the folks that opportunity, but then, also, growing our, referral networks and encouraging people to embrace Bitcoin in their practice, even if they tend to be a little bit more normie focused right now. So I think that was our goal of the conference, and we were definitely able to achieve that, or at least really kind of kickstart those steps.
Really cool. Yeah, no, I think that I think that answers a little bit of my next question about kind of like the types of people that kind of attended the event. But it does sound like, on the one hand, it's sort of people who are interested in the new products and for their own investing purposes and so forth, but then also industry professionals who kind of want to network with other industry professionals and build those kind of networks and referral partnerships together.
That's exactly right. And I would say probably one of the bigger subsets of folks, regardless of their minute industry, whether that's wealth management, CPAs, asset managers or whatever, a lot of these folks are Bitcoiners personally, and they're trying to figure out how to integrate it into their business, whether they have decision-making ability and they just want to understand the quote-unquote fine print more and how this works in practice, or they're looking to learn from other people on how they integrated Bitcoin into their respective firms, and they can take that to their practice and their leadership team. And it was really cool. A lot of fun ideas being tossed around.
Awesome. So will it happen again next year? Will it be like an annual event? Is that the plan, or what do you think?
Yes. We will. We had a ton of fun doing it. Great reception. I do think asked me in August or September when we were in the dog days of planning this thing, or it's like, yeah, I don't know, Ted. This is a lot of work, but I think it was ultimately worth it.
Amazing. Super cool. No, maybe I'll see if I find myself on that side of the pond next year. Maybe I'll try to attend and bring some inspiration back to Europe. So one kind of side point here, maybe diverting into a little bit of some of your values-based perspectives on Bitcoin. Most people view Bitcoin still as a speculative asset. I think more and more Bitcoiners will, of course, understand it as the next form of money. But you frame it as like a bit of a moral imperative. Do you want to maybe elaborate a bit more on this kind of moral aspect of Bitcoin and the way you see it?
Absolutely. No, thank you for the opportunity. This is something, very close to my heart. I should preface this for educational purposes only, not investment advice, thoughts and opinions of my own, and not that of my firm. But I think Bitcoin is the most moral, investment you could possibly make, which is very exciting to me. I'm a proud Catholic, and we really try to integrate my faith and values into, our firm and how we do business and how we're, advising clients. And I think this really stems from, a few different things. And so I'm a fan of macroeconomics. I'm not like a formal economist or anything. It's just a nerdy interest of mine. If there's a stain on that industry, I think it's very, when we're talking about macroeconomics and these very complex systems, there's so many data points. It's easy for us to cherry pick those and draw our own conclusions. And we didn't even realize we missed half the picture or whatever. And so when I'm working with clients to help them understand the moment they're in, we really just try to zoom out and think thematically. And I'm a big believer in the fourth turning thesis. I'm a big believer in Ray Dalio's 250-year sovereign debt crisis. And those two things are almost perfectly overlapping. And so I think we're going to be in a structural upheaval economically, socially, culturally over the next 10 years. And if it wasn't for Bitcoin, I think I'd be pretty black-pilled. But fortunately, we have this exciting new technology that gives us some insight on how to weather these storms moving into the future. But what I find that is very reassuring is actually looking back to the past, and specifically within the Catholic tradition. We should be very proud. It's called the noblesse oblige, which stands for nobility obligates. And these old aristocratic Catholic families of old Europe, they had a very strong moral worldview that guided how they stewarded their wealth, and they felt responsible for taking care of their hyper-local community. And I think that's just a beautiful Bitcoin analogy. And so if we kind of rely on those lessons of the past and understanding Bitcoin is just money, it's just a technology, we need a strong moral worldview around it and how we make decisions. But we really emphasize in our practice that whether we like it or not, we're the first generation of Bitcoiners, and there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. And so we spend a lot of time identifying charities or heirs that we want this asset passed on to, and it's finitely scarce, and it's not guaranteed to get to that next generation if we're not good stewards with the wealth. And specifically when we're forecasting a financial plan, it ends up being a larger dollar amount at the end of the plan than people may have initially anticipated. And so it's really preparing ourselves to step into that role to be good stewards of the assets we've been entrusted with on earth, and making sure the next generation looks to us proudly, and we can set an example of what it means to really be a Bitcoiner.
Yeah, really cool. I think it's great perspectives on this kind of Dalio's big debt cycle, the fourth turning. As you said, they kind of perfectly overlap. So I tend to agree with you. I think we're kind of living through this shifting in geopolitical and economic orders, right? And I think Bitcoin is a core part of that. And I think it's an optimistic part of it. I think without Bitcoin, I tend to agree with you. I think it'd be a bit of a doomer, right? We're heading towards World War III. The world's going to be chaos. It's going to be hell. But it does seem like there is this spark or flame of like hope that is Bitcoin that I think is just growing stronger every day with more people joining the Bitcoin network. So it keeps me optimistic, at least in that regard. So in this regard, I mean, I think you maybe, touched on this a little bit, but this idea of like personal sovereignty and personal responsibility fitting into the new paradigm. So like, if we are kind of going through a fourth turning, I mean, how do you see us coming out the other side? Is it going to be a more decentralized kind of future, or how do you, if at all, can you predict?
Yeah, I do think it's going to be a more decentralized future. And I think Bitcoin's super feature is that it gives its holders the ability to take custody of the asset themselves. So we actually see wealth and a bear asset being distributed as opposed to gold. Kind of famously, there's very few custodians, and we see that wealth, even though there may be representations of people owning that, but the asset being centralized, I don't think is a good thing for financial systems or plumbing at large. And I think we actually see a lot of manipulation that is possible with that dynamic. So the fourth turning, said another way, is strong men create good times create weak men create hard times. And I think that's a tried and true lesson. Again, kind of looking to the past, it gives me a lot of comfort where I can get a bit in my own head. It's like, well, actually, I don't need to recreate the wheel myself. We other people have been through this before, and we can lean on their wisdom and identify ways to move forward, even if the circumstances are slightly different. And so, and I think we do have a vacuum of strong men and strong leadership in the world at large. I think our secular culture has really kind of eroded any sorts of truth or fundamental societal norms. When you're in a position like that, everything becomes distorted, so it's hard to make sense of how to move forward. And so trying to be the leader of my family and a strong man today, I'm not void of those responsibilities. My responsibilities has just changed, so I don't have to go out and till the field anymore, but I do have to take it upon myself to learn how to set up a self-custody wallet and be in full control of my wealth, or try to experiment with other open source software, like hosting my own documents and my own pictures, and not just mindlessly onboarding my family and our information to somebody else's server. So the responsibilities are still there. I think they've just changed, and it's up for us to really kind of embrace what is going to be most beneficial for ourselves, our family, and our heirs moving forward.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of kind of thinking about it, right? I guess the thing we're responsible for is changing in terms of how it's manifested in reality, but it's that underlying ethos of responsibility is still kind of a constant that we need to kind of adhere to, right? Because I think, this idea of data, for example, right? 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, people were like, what are you even talking about, right?
Right.
But now it's it is important that we have self-sovereignty and understand the implications of the value that's inherent in that, right? Very, very cool perspectives I totally jive with. If we kind of turn it now back a little bit more into the kind of corporate finance space, I know most of your clients might be a combination of high net worth individuals, small businesses and stuff, right? But insofar as you are kind of supporting businesses and business leaders and CFOs or owners of businesses, how are they interpreting this idea of a monetary reordering and having a new monetary base? Do your clients need to kind of, is it important for you that your clients understand that kind of macro shift that's ongoing, or is it enough if they kind of just see Bitcoin as a hedge, as in case of more of a digital gold that's just a kind of a risk-off asset? To what extent is that alignment in understanding important for your clients?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll take the hedge. If they've gotten that far, it's okay, we got an in, and then over the course of working with them, I'll consistently try to build on that. But this is even reflected in some of our more traditional capital market strategies. But our overall investment thesis is the return to real world hard assets. I do think when we're even doing a financial plan, even for somebody that doesn't have Bitcoin exposure yet, we model inflation at 6%, because that's the average M2 money supply growth over the last 2 years. And so that's fundamental in how we see the world, and we want to make sure we're preparing them for that, and not just painting the picture they want to see, but adding value to them and doing our fiduciary responsibility to make sure they understand their entire financial landscape. And obviously, if the base market money is manipulated, everything else, every other market on top of that is going to be manipulated. And for some folks, that's a hard pill to swallow, and it's certainly not the most fun news to deliver. But we have to step in that role and make sure we're being truthful and honest with our clients. It's actually much easier for gold bugs, because they already understand the money's broken. They just maybe are not as in tuned or familiar with Bitcoin, which I do really enjoy talking with those folks. It's pretty fun. But to answer your question, I really do think kind of the cat is out of the bag when it comes to fiat monetary systems. I think we're starting to see like onshoring of gold and like hard assets kind of moving quietly at the institutional level. I'm not sure if like the average Joe individual investor is totally attuned to that. I think Bitcoiners are broadly more in tune with that, but specifically in the US, the majority of my clients are. We have the government, making large moves. We have the strategic Bitcoin reserve. We have talk of a sovereign wealth fund, and everything that they intend to invest in is real, physical, scarce, hard assets. And so, if we're trying to see around corners and give our clients the best advice moving forward, that's what we want to be rooted in. It's, I think, a little murky right now, just because we have 50 plus years of this, unbacked fiat, money printing galore experiment. And we get like this facade that, everything's okay. And we really kind of have to peel back the layers of the onions to see what's going on at the base layer. And I think that, personally, that's exciting. Those are the assets like I think we want exposure to. I think, history would show us that those assets, prove to perform well regardless of market conditions. And it's a understanding over the last 10 15 years we've just been exporting tech stocks and dollars, and that's actually probably a less sustainable thing as opposed to the tried and true that's proven to work for much longer.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think I tend to see it in a similar way. I think in this kind of like, I sort of see it as this, as you mentioned earlier, like once you see Bitcoin, you can't unsee it. So I use the analogy of like, it's a one-way street and everybody's sort of, but it is a spectrum, I think, to like full understanding. And I don't know if everybody will fully understand, but the way I see it is like, at least stewards of capital are gradually awakening to this. But of course it might start with just, okay, I get 2% because maybe something disastrous happens. But I think you're right. As you said, the cat's out of the bag. And I think that's this debasement trade that JP Morgan is now dubbed is very much aligned with the Bitcoin thesis that we've been talking about for 10, 15 years, right? So I think it is this awakening that's taking a resurgence, and it is kind of gradually happening. But where people, and even as myself as a Bitcoiner, I think I kind of, people get that the more they understand it. And it's very rare that people kind of day one jump to maxi status or something, right?
Right. Well, and just to add some more context to that is I have this bulky analogy where it's like the bigger they are, the harder they fall. I've, dubbed that into the more complex system it is, the longer it will take to unravel. And I think one thing, I hate giving these people credit because I don't have a lot of respect for them, but the powers that be are very clever creating artificial demand for dollars. I think this started post 71 with, the petrodollar and, the US specifically promising to defend Saudi Arabia militarily if they price their oil, their energy, their oil in dollars. And I think the second or possibly third phase of that is really kind of the Genius Act and the stablecoin proliferation. And, we're seeing the issuance of treasuries, and there are no sovereigns buying treasuries anymore. There's really no market for it.
Belong in now, right? Pretty much.
Exactly. Like our own central bank buying our own debt. Like it was, that's not a sustainable system. But that's kind of further evidence we use of like the cat's out of the bag, where the decision makers, high end decision makers in these countries, they don't want U.S. debt, but they've created a different way to generate artificial demand for U.S. debt and treasuries via stable coins. And so, that's true. I don't know when hyper Bitcoinization will happen. I do think it will eventually happen, but we kind of have to go through these shifts of the artificial dollar demand creation.
Totally agree. Yeah, it's fascinating. And I think there's so much uncertainty on, I personally, as you kind of brought up, like it's the most interesting place to, space to work in. And I think part of what makes it interesting is because there's a bit of uncertainty. It's going to have profound implications, but exactly the pathway to get there, is it going to be this rapid change? Is it going to be super gradual? I think that makes it very exciting just day by day to see how it's unfolding. Yeah. And I think, you brought up the dollar. And I think that a fundamental issue is like, it doesn't make sense to have one nation state being the issuer of a global currency. There is this need to have one currency. It's inefficient to have many of them. And we, of course, have that because of political reasons, right? But we will kind of harmonize to one. And I think that exorbitant privilege has also been a detriment to the U.S. in some ways that we're seeing now manifest through the political issues of the Midwest getting hollowed out through the Triffin dilemma and all this. I don't know if you have time to dive into that, but it is this fascinating paradox of like a strength is also a weakness. Now they're kind of it's reaching this kind of breaking point, but of course they're going to try to prolong it for as long as possible while still devaluing it, and this need to have a strong dollar but also weaken it. It's interesting to see the paradoxical nature of it having to try to play out.
Well, it totally is, and the phrase I use all the time, which I've only seen credited to Spider-Man, which I have a hard time believing, but with great power comes great responsibility, and I think it's an absolute shame as a proud American. Like, it makes me very sad and a hard pill to swallow, where it's like we're only in this position because of poor leadership. That's solely it, and we abused our dollar privilege, and there are consequences to that. And then that's what I think is very unique about Bitcoin. Obviously came from the kind of economics, finance perspective. The technology side a little less native to me, a little more effort to try to understand, but how rare and unique a decentralized system truly is. I think the only other case you could really kind of make is the internet, and that's even far less true now. I'm not saying you were saying this, but just nuance when we're talking to people in the Bitcoin space, where it's like, I don't believe in central bank digital currencies. I think that's like the only thing that would bring me to the streets to actually protest or like this. I don't think the idea, like you said, either. I agree, like a global reserve currency is a good idea, but I think Bitcoin works as a neutral monetary asset because it's actually neutral. One country, company, or entity can control it. I don't think people really kind of understand what a decentralized system is, because there aren't any.
Exactly. I mean, it's such a new paradigm, right? To kind of move to a decentralized money. It's and that's what makes Bitcoin so fascinating, right? And I think I'm with you on that kind of the U.S. abusing its privilege in a sense, but I also think of it. We're using tons of metaphors here, right? But like the Lord of the Rings, the ring of power, right? It kind of corrupts people. So I think once you have the power, you're going to be corrupted. No matter which country had been in that position, I think all of them would have eventually abused the opportunity they had to kind of just print more money, right? So I think the U.S. is great that it lasted as long as it did, right? From 45 to 71 and then beyond, right? But no, I don't think it's a U.S. specific thing, and I think it's the world in a sense that kind of decided to put that privilege into one country's hand in the first place. And of course, it made sense at the end of World War II. Probably it was pragmatic approach. Bitcoin wasn't an alternative. Gold was not fully functional, so it made sense. I personally am of the view that like anybody conspired to screw the rest of the world over, right? But it's just circumstantially that that's where we ended up. I'd like to kind of dive in the next section, like into a bit more on the pragmatic aspects of how you've built your business. Sorry, I'm trying to look at my notes here. I noticed that you've kind of also collaborated with Bitcoin Audible and Space Denver. So it'd be interesting to hear about these kind of like different partnerships and kind of how you see the mutual benefit between Basilic and the other organizations that you partner with.
Yeah, definitely. The space, I always tell people it'll probably be the coolest project I work on in my career. So if people have been to like Bitcoin Park, or I know there's a space in Lugano, then I think I know some folks in Scotland were trying to get one up and running. I've heard, rumblings of one coming in London as well. But, these are, Bitcoin citadels. So it's just like a physical, Bitcoin hub. And you can kind of think of it as co-working, social space, or, social club meets event space meets like trade organization. We went about it a little differently. We didn't have, like a whale or whatever that was willing to, just fork over whatever to get this off the ground. It was a true community effort. So we had in Denver, we had a, awesome, bit devs gathering and, a strong Bitcoin community. And we always joke like the front range, it's got a very high cypherpunk to NPC ratio. A lot of defense contractor, a lot of NSA.
NPC ratio. That's the first time for that before. I'm going to use that one in the future.
Yeah, that's one of our prouder accomplishments is coming up with that. But, you still get like a little the Pioneer West, ethos and stuff. Not that I'm particularly interested in these, but a lot of other cryptocurrencies that have started in the Boulder, Denver metro as well. So definitely, a strong market for something like this. And so we started, raising dues. Ultimately, we're able to rent a building, and, members chip in where they fit in. And I think that unfortunately, especially younger generations, like this idea of community is really lost. It's been kind of, eroded. And, I consider myself a child of the internet, but nothing beats getting together in real life. And so that's been an awesome, project, because, community building's hard. You have to be intentional. You have to, make investments into people. Soft, mushy thing that doesn't have, like a formula you follow, but it's extremely, rewarding. I give the space and the Denver Bitcoin community at large, a ton of credit for Basilic and how we've created our company, because my peers and my friends are other, Bitcoin maximalists. And, the type. They have a high, bar, and, if you're, below that bar, like they will let you know. And just, practicality, to your point of how that's, reflected in Basilic, one of the things we do that's kind of unique, I would say, in the wealth management industry, definitely, but I say even among some Bitcoin financial advisors I've met, is we don't charge AUM on Bitcoin, because that's rent seeking. I'm not evaluating this cryptocurrency over that one. I'm literally just telling you to buy and hold Bitcoin. So we've, structured our business model where we can, more accurately represent how we think the Bitcoin financial services industry should operate. And, I wouldn't have probably done that if it wasn't without a strong peer group holding me, accountable, which is fun. And then through the space, I got introduced to a guy that's just kind of a side hustle of mine. He's a great man, and I really have been a loyal listener and enjoyed his work for a long time. So I just got the opportunity to sell some podcast sponsorships for him, and know
is that
a lot
Bitcoin
of
Audible? Is that that's Bitcoin Audible? Okay, got it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's just been awesome. All these different efforts, meeting and getting to know different people and businesses in the Bitcoin industry. Like, it very much is rising tide lifts all boats. I've never been a part of a movement or anything like this has been so willing to help each other out, and learn from each other or benefit each other. And so all those connections really kind of ultimately come back to me being able to better serve Bitcoiners.
Love it. Yeah. And I think that was one thing that's special about the way Bitcoin works, right? This like network effect. We are kind of one of the network layers of the Bitcoin protocol, is like the human network connection, in the sense that, we all benefit when Bitcoin benefits. I think it's quite a bit different than a lot of traditional financial paradigms, the fiat paradigm, where it tends to be a bit of a zero-sum game in most circumstances. So I think it really encourages, collaboration and cooperation. Really, very cool. Can you maybe just elaborate a bit more on the space itself? Like, what can you just describe, like, where is it located? And also, because I think, here in Denmark, we don't have something like that yet. And I have some friends that are setting up the Danish Bitcoin policy initiative.
Nice.
So maybe they can get some inspiration for like setting up a similar space here. Maybe just a couple more details on kind of where it's situated, what the space looks like.
Yeah, we totally lucked out. It's a beautiful building. It's located in the River North neighborhood of Denver, right off the train track. So it's actually fun, as kind of the word's gotten out. Denver, major airport in the U.S. and international as well, and so it's easy for our neighbors, to come and visit. And people are actually like hopping on the train, during a long layover, coming to check out the space, hanging out for a little bit, then popping back to the airport. But it's about 6,500 square foot building. It's kind of 3 rectangles, 2 side by side, and then 1 on top of each other. Upstairs we got private offices. That's where I office out of. And so, get to work around, Bitcoiners and people building within Bitcoin every day, which is super infectious and energetic. We're really kind of pushing each other, forward, which, I won't trade for anything. And, one of the sides we use for events. And so we've been in our building for a year this month. We moved in 10/1 of 24, and we've had over 100 events. And these range from bigger events like the Bitcoin Financial Services Summit, or the HEPUC Summit, which is kind of more of like a mini conference, focused on, one thing. Or, we just host our Women in Bitcoin meetup, or BitDevs meetup, or, we've had Bitcoin companies come do a company offsite. And there's something, cool just about being in a Bitcoin focused, physical location. It's more fun, definitely more fun than just your random hotel conference room. So that kind of, inspires people. But then, kind of, a broader mission is just like bringing, folks together from, different walks of life and helping educate them on Bitcoin or growing Bitcoin adoption. Like it all really kind of happens under one flag. And I'm a big fan of Balaji Srinivasan and his network state ideology. And he was on this podcast once and they were asking him, it's like, well, how do you take back San Francisco? And then it's like, how do you fix San Francisco? And he's like, one block at a time. And that's always resonated with me because I think, to just kind of broadly or high level, like understand the space is like, well, we planted our orange flag and it's like, people know like, this is what we're about. And, we've gone out into the community to tell folks and, bring them in. It's like, this is what we're about. And, I highly encourage anyone that's interested in doing it to do this. It's very hard, don't get me wrong, but a worthwhile exercise.
Amazing. I'll have to introduce you to my friend Johannes, who's kind of the one who's trying to do a bit more grassroots stuff here in Copenhagen. So he might get some inspiration from you. It'd be a good meeting.
Oh, right on.
If you have the time for it, I think it'd be cool. Yeah, but it's great you mentioned Balaji. That was kind of one of the next questions I had, was kind of talking about some of the folks that inspired you, Balaji, Lynn Alden, and others. Are there any other, Bitcoin thinkers in the space that have popped up on your radar a bit more recently that you'd like to share with the audience that you think could inspire us if we're not already aware of them?
Yeah, I once, definitely off the cuff, I've, benefited, a lot over the last couple of years of learning from, other financiers. I think, probably the most well-known Bitcoiner at this point, but I think Michael Saylor will go down as, a captain of industry for what he's done for corporate finance. And I really think that is the Bitcoinization of finance thesis playing out. So I'm a huge fan, a supporter of what he's done, for the industry. Guys like Andrew Hones, I think, are moving the industry forward in very clever and unique ways. Battery finance has a dual collateralization system. So you'll generally go to like real estate projects. And he's talked about this on CNBC famously, like this, one apartment complex, like they refinanced the loan and added, Bitcoin to the balance sheets. And now their investors have a dual collateralized, asset with, the Bitcoin upside, which is just like very cool. He also kind of pioneered the bit bonds, thesis and ideology, which is essentially the same thing. Very optimistic for things like that. Pierre Rochard has had a tremendous effect on, he's also, launched the Bitcoin bond company, specifically within my industry. I've learned a lot from, Morgan Rochard and the folks over at the Bitcoin Financial Advisors Network. We do a quarterly, brain trust call and just get to share, our own experiences and case studies. And again, technically, like we, by the letter of the law, be in competition with each other, but we all benefit from learning from each other and how to service clients in this new landscape and willing and interested in embracing Bitcoin.
Love it. No, those are all interesting perspectives. And I think on the battery finance side and on the bit bonds, I think that also plays into my view on, we talked earlier about like, how is this transition going to unfold? And I sort of see it most likely playing out in a kind of multi-decade manner, but where the Bitcoin component of these financial products just gets to become a bigger and bigger portion of it, right? And I think it acts as a nice natural hedge against what's becoming more risky is the products that are based on the fiat denominated things, or let's say inferior forms of money more generally, like real estate. I'd say like real estate has become monetized, and I think it's at risk of seeing devaluation in real terms, maybe not in nominal terms, but in real terms. Having a Bitcoin component in these loans, I think provides like a reinforcement to for the future. So it's really cool. I totally agree with Andrew Hones and Pierre and those guys. Very cool. So, let's zoom out to like 2035. So 10 years from now, how do you think, people are going to look back on, let's phrase it this way. How do you think the world look that might be a contrarian perspective that most people might not agree with, if at all, if there's anything that you have kind of some wild views of the future?
Yeah. I would say there's probably three. I will start with my most aggressive and maybe move to my most obvious in that order. I think one of the things people aren't totally in tune with or aware of yet that I think is kind of going to be a slap to the face is, everybody's been talking about for a while now, like this great, wealth transfer from, like the boomers to like the millennials. And I think that's largely fake, specifically within the US, at least most people's net worth is tied up in their primary residence. And so with real estate specifically, I'm not the biggest hater, but I'm not the biggest fan. And I think it was just like the most scarce store of value that the average Joe could get their hands on. And so that's why we see, this huge monetary premium on top of, the utility value of the asset itself. And, Denver's like not a cheap real estate market. And my wife and I will occasionally hop on Zillow for, kicks and giggles. I just end up laughing. I was like, how in the world, is this, 1948 home, worth $1 million? It's the, probably hardly worth like the materials it's built out of, like, some land value, all that stuff. Moral of the story is that, so you could pass on the asset and the paper value of that asset, but when that asset goes to trade, I think there's going to be a rude awakening where that value is not actually going to be manifested at its appreciated amount that a lot of people live their life on. And I think specifically I kind of straddle millennial, Gen Z, as those buyers move into the marketplace, they're just not going to be willing to purchase asset at those prices, and we will kind of see the value of those assets trade lower, which means less of a wealth transfer. So I think that's kind of a mirage and smoke and mirrors. One of the things I'm super bullish on that I think people in various communities are in tune to is the return to like tradition and the return to truth. I think our society has become so secularized, and we don't have any sort of like shared cultural norms because everything's been distorted. I give fiat money a ton of credit to that, specifically within the Catholic community, which I'm also a big part of here in Denver. It's like this return to tradition. Like, we want the reverence. Like, we are leaving behind the church of the 70s and 80s that want to be the church of the world, as opposing to the church leading the world. And so we're starting to see a return to our roots, and I think there's a large resurgence of the conservative movement in America, and from what I see on Twitter, in Europe as well, which is exciting. And then the third, and probably more obvious to Bitcoiners, but I just want to, you really kind of alluded to it, and I want to build on it from our last point, is, I'm certainly not here to defend all the ills of the finance industry, but what I really want Bitcoiners to understand is that every industry is susceptible to fiatness, and I really think of finance broadly as the business of money, so it's particularly susceptible. But I don't think we get to hyper Bitcoinization without the finance industry. And so I think the most peaceful and graceful transition is these products like battery finance and the Bitcoin bond company, because we're going to slowly recollateralize our financial system using these TradFi products. Pierre Rochard did not think of a bond. He just, is applying it to Bitcoin. I think that's ultimately going to kind of like be one of the best Trojan horse vehicles to get people, may start as fairly synthetic exposure to Bitcoin, but over time, with more and more of these developments, I think we're going to actually slowly recapitalize and ingrain, or, build our financial system and institutions on a much more solid Bitcoin footing.
Cool. No, I tend to agree with you. And I think it's to some degree a controversial perspective, that third one, with like the hardcore original Bitcoiners who are like, we're going to be outside the system. We're going to build this entirely parallel thing. And I tend to agree with you. I think the way Bitcoin wins is through integration with the existing financial architecture. And I think it's very exciting to see it unfold. We're almost out of time. I wanted to just hear a little bit about the hunting trip before we wrap up. How did it go?
Oh man, I mean, it's awesome, getting off grid and into the wilderness. Unfortunately, we came back empty-handed. Particularly frustrating this type of time around, because we were hunting elk and we saw a ton of mule deer. We saw a bunch of turkeys. We saw a couple moose. We heard elk. We saw a bunch of elk sign, but no elk. So it's like chasing the ghost. So it was like almost getting mocked that we saw all this other wildlife. So it's like, we're in it. We know they have to be around here, but nonetheless unsuccessful.
And was that in the Colorado Rockies, or where were you doing
That's
that?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. But I'm sure the experience was still worth it, right? Bonding with the boys and forging some new memories.
It's the best. I think it's like probably the most badass thing. Put yourself in that position and mindset. And I just think it's a ton of fun, super valuable skills and experiences to be had from it.
Really cool. And before we wind up, where can folks find you, find Basilic if they're interested in learning more?
Yeah, man. No, thank you so much for having me on. This was an awesome conversation. We have a lot in common. So I was honored when you asked me to come on. This was a fun talk. And if you're interested in my professional services, you can book a free consultation at basilic.io. If you want to follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn, those two platforms I'm most active. LinkedIn, Wyatt O'Rourke, Twitter, Wyatt O'Rourke _. And then if you're interested in my personal writings, those are at wyattorourke.com. And then my book can be purchased or downloaded at brainsbooks.com.
Fantastic. We'll make sure we put all that information into the description when we go to publish. Thanks so much, Wyatt. It's been a fantastic conversation. Look forward to getting in touch in the future on some of these follow-up discussions we had. And enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Ted.